An anthology of readings of Almighty God's words. The Inside Truth of the Work of Conquest, 2. You used to seek to reign as kings, and today you have yet to completely let go of this. You still wish to reign as kings, to hold up the heavens and support the earth. Now, consider this question. Do you possess such qualifications? Are you not being totally senseless? Is what you seek and devote your attention to realistic? You are not even possessed of normal humanity. Is it not pathetic? Thus, today I only talk of being conquered, bearing testimony, improving your caliber, and entering onto the path of being made perfect, and do not speak of anything else. Some people are weary of the unadulterated truth, and when they see all this talk of normal humanity and improving people's caliber, they are reluctant. Those who do not love the truth are not easy to make perfect. As long as you enter today and act according to God's will, step by step, could you be eliminated? After God has done so much work in the mainland of China, work of such great scale, and after He has spoken so many words, could He give up halfway? Could He lead people down into the bottomless pit? Today, the crucial point is that you must know the substance of man, and must know what you should enter into. You must talk of entry into life, and changes in disposition, how to actually be conquered, and how to completely obey God, how to bear final testimony to God, and how to achieve obedience unto death. You must focus on these things, and that which is not realistic or important must first be put aside and disregarded. Today, you should be aware of how to be conquered, and of how people conduct themselves after they have been conquered. You may say you have been conquered, but can you obey unto death? You must be able to follow to the very end, regardless of whether there are any prospects. And you must not lose faith in God, regardless of the environment. Ultimately, you must achieve two aspects of testimony: the testimony of Job, obedience unto death, and the testimony of Peter, the supreme love of God. In one respect, you must be like Job. He lost all material possessions and was beset by the pain of the flesh. Yet he did not forsake the name of Jehovah. This was Job's testimony. Peter was able to love God unto death. When he was put on the cross and faced his death, he still loved God. He did not think of his own prospects or pursue beautiful hopes or extravagant thoughts. And he sought only to love God and to obey all of God's arrangements. Such is the standard you must achieve before you can be considered to have borne testimony, before you become someone who has been made perfect after having been conquered. Today, if people truly knew their own substance and status, would they still seek prospects and hopes? What you should know is this: regardless of whether God makes me perfect, I must follow God. Everything He does now is good and done for my sake, and so that our disposition can change and we can rid ourselves of Satan's influence, to allow us to be born in the land of filth and yet rid ourselves of impurity. Shake off the filth and the influence of Satan to leave it behind. Of course, this is what is required of you, but for God it is merely conquest, done so that people have the resolve to obey and can submit to all of God's orchestrations. This way, things will be accomplished. Today, most people have already been conquered, but within them there is still much that is rebellious and disobedient. People's true stature is still too small, and they can only become full of vigor if there are hopes and prospects. Lacking hopes and prospects, they become negative and even think about leaving God. Furthermore, people have no great desire to seek to live out normal humanity. This is unacceptable. Thus, I must still talk of conquest. In fact, perfection occurs at the same time as conquest. As you are conquered, the first effects of being made perfect are also achieved. Where there is a difference between being conquered and being made perfect, it is according to the degree of change in people. Being conquered is the first step of being made perfect, and does not mean that they have been completely made perfect, nor prove that they have been completely gained by God. After people have been conquered, there are some changes in their disposition, but such changes fall far short of those in people who have been completely gained by God. Today, what is done is the initial work of making people perfect, conquering them, and if you cannot achieve being conquered, then you will have no means of being made perfect and being completely gained by God. You will merely gain a few words of chastisement and judgment, but they will be incapable of completely changing your heart. Thus, you will be one of those who are eliminated. It will be no different from looking at a sumptuous feast upon the table, but not eating it. Is that not a tragic scenario for you? And so you must seek changes. Whether it is being conquered or being made perfect, both relate to whether there are changes in you, and whether or not you are obedient. And this determines whether or not you can be gained by God. Know that being conquered and being made perfect are simply based on the extent of change and obedience, as well as on how pure your love of God is. What is required today is that you can be completely made perfect, but in the beginning you must be conquered. You must have sufficient knowledge of God's chastisement and judgment, must have the faith to follow, and be one who seeks change and seeks knowledge of God. Only then will you be someone who seeks to be made perfect. You should understand that in the course of being made perfect, you will be conquered. And in the course of being conquered, you will be made perfect. Today, you can seek to be made perfect or seek changes in your external humanity and improvements in your caliber. But of principal importance is that you can understand that everything that God does today has meaning and is of benefit. It enables you who are born in a land of filth to escape the filth and shake it off. It enables you to overcome the influence of Satan and leave behind the dark influence of Satan. By focusing on these things, you are protected in this land of filth. Ultimately, what testimony will you be asked to give? You are born in a land of filth, but are able to become holy, never again to be sullied by filth, to live under the domain of Satan, but divest yourself of Satan's influence, to be neither possessed nor harassed by Satan, and to live in the hands of the Almighty. This is the testimony and the proof of victory in the battle with Satan. You are able to forsake Satan. You no longer reveal satanic dispositions in what you live out, but instead live out that which God required that man attain when He created man. Normal humanity, normal sense, normal insight, normal resolve to love God and loyalty to God. Such is the testimony borne by a creature of God. You say, "We are born in a land of filth," but because of God's protection, because of His leadership, and because He has conquered us, we have rid ourselves of the influence of Satan. That we can obey today is also the effect of being conquered by God. And it is not because we are good, or because we naturally loved God. It is because God chose us and predestined us that we have been conquered today, are able to bear testimony to Him and can serve Him. So too, it is because He chose us and protected us that we have been saved and delivered from the domain of Satan, and can leave behind the filth and be purified in the nation of the great red dragon. In addition, what you live out externally will show that you are possessed of normal humanity. There is sense to what you say, and you live out the likeness of a normal person. When others see you, you should not cause them to say, "Is this not the image of the great red dragon?" The sister's conduct is unbecoming of a sister. The brother's conduct is unbecoming of a brother. And you have none of the decorum of the saints. Then people would say, "No wonder God said they are the descendants of Moab. He was totally right." If people look at you and say, "Though God said you are the descendants of Moab," what you are living out has proven that you have left behind the influence of Satan. Although those things are still inside you, you are able to turn your backs on them. This shows that you have been completely conquered. You who have been conquered and saved will say, "It is true that we are the descendants of Moab, but we have been saved by God. And although the descendants of Moab in the past were forsaken and cursed, and exiled among Gentiles by the people of Israel, today God has saved us. It is true that we are the most corrupt of all people. This was decreed by God. This is fact, and it is undeniable by all. But today we have escaped that influence. We detest our ancestor. We are willing to turn our backs on our ancestor, to utterly forsake it and obey all of God's arrangements, acting according to God's will and achieving His requirements of us, and attaining the satisfaction of God's will. Moab betrayed God. He did not act according to God's will, and he was hated by God. But we should be caring of God's heart, and today, since we understand God's will, we cannot betray God and must renounce our old ancestor. Previously, I spoke of renouncing the great red dragon, and today it is mainly about the renouncement of people's old ancestor. This is one testimony of people's conquest, and regardless of how you enter today, your testimony in this area must not be lacking. People's caliber is too poor. They lack too much normal humanity. Their reactions are too slow, too sluggish. Satan's corruption has left them numb and dull-witted. And although they cannot completely change in 1 or 2 years, they must have the resolve to cooperate. It can be said that this is also a testimony before Satan. The testimony of today is the effect achieved by the present work of conquest, as well as a specimen and model for the followers of the future. In the future, it will spread to all nations. The work that is done in China will spread to all nations. The descendants of Moab are the lowliest of all the world's people. Some people ask, are not Ham's descendants the lowliest of all? The progeny of the great red dragon and the descendants of Ham are of different representative significance, and the descendants of Ham are a different matter. Regardless of how they are cursed, they are still the descendants of Noah. The origins of Moab, meanwhile, were not pure. Moab came from fornication, and in this lies the difference. Though both were cursed, their statuses were not the same, and so the descendants of Moab are the lowliest of all people. And there could be no fact more convincing than the conquest of the lowliest of all people. The work of the last days breaks with all rules, and regardless of whether you are cursed or punished, as long as you help my work and are of benefit to the work of conquest today, and regardless of whether you are a descendant of Moab or the progeny of the great red dragon, as long as you could perform the duty of a creature of God in this stage of work and do the best you can, then the due effect will be achieved. You are the progeny of the great red dragon, and you are a descendant of Moab. In sum, all who are of flesh and blood are the creatures of God, and were made by the Creator. You are a creature of God. You should not have any choice, and this is your duty. Of course, today the Creator's work is directed at the entire universe. Regardless of who you are descended from, above all, you are one of God's creatures. You, the descendants of Moab, are part of God's creatures, with the only difference being that you are of lower worth. Since today, God's work is carried out amongst all creatures and aimed at the entire universe, the Creator is free to select any people, matters, or things in order to do His work. He cares not who you used to be descended from, as long as you are one of His creatures, and as long as you are beneficial to His work, the work of conquest and testimony. He will carry out His work in you without any hesitation. This shatters people's traditional notions, which are that God will never work among the Gentiles, especially not those who have been cursed and are lowly. For those who have been cursed, all future generations that come from them will forever also be cursed, with never any chance of salvation. God will never descend and work in a Gentile land, and will never set foot in a land of filth, for He is holy. All these notions have been shattered by God's work in the last days. Know that God is the God of all creatures. He holds dominion over the heavens and earth and all things, and is not only the God of the people of Israel. Thus, this work in China is of the utmost significance, and will it not be spread among all nations? The great testimony of the future will not be limited to China. If God only conquered you, could the demons be convinced? They do not understand being conquered, or the great power of God, and only when God's chosen people throughout the whole universe behold the ultimate effects of this work will all creatures be conquered. None are more backward or corrupt than the descendants of Moab. Only if these people can be conquered, they who are the most corrupt, who did not acknowledge God or believe that there is a God, have been conquered, and acknowledge God in their mouths, praise Him, and are able to love Him. Will this be the testimony of conquest? Although you are not Peter, you live out the image of Peter. You are able to possess the testimony of Peter and of Job, and this is the greatest testimony. Ultimately, you will say, "We are not the Israelites, but the forsaken descendants of Moab. We are not Peter, whose caliber we are incapable of, nor Job, and we can't even compare to Paul's resolve to suffer for God and dedicate himself to God. And we are so backward, and thus we are unqualified to enjoy God's blessings. God has still lifted us up today, so we must satisfy God. And although we are of insufficient caliber or qualifications, we are willing to satisfy God. We have this resolve. We are the descendants of Moab, and we were cursed. This was decreed by God, and we are incapable of changing it. But our living out and our knowledge can change, and we are resolved to satisfy God. When you have this resolve, it will prove that you have testified to being conquered.